Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And today I want to talk a bit about how Franklin Roosevelt in 1941 began to transform the American peacetime economy into a war production economy. Now, about a year ago, probably now, I did a series of podcasts about Roosevelt and Churchill from 1939 to 41, and you may well have listened to those. And they were really all about the decline in military and diplomatic power of Britain in the face of crisis in 1940 and the almost unstoppable force that Nazi Germany seemed to present, and the response that came from America all the way up to Roosevelt's election in November, or re-election in November 1940. But Roosevelt, now with a Congress who saw little other alternative than to go with the fairly unpopular policy of assisting, short of war, the Allied powers, the British and the French, though now obviously at this point France had fallen, had to go along with Roosevelt and his commitment to creating the arsenal of democracy that he spoke about in his Arsenals of Democracy speech, fireside chat in 1940. But the actual creation of this economic war machine was another matter altogether. In his book Freedom from Fear, America 1929 to 1945, David Kennedy writes about Roosevelt and in this period of time. He says, Roosevelt had committed the United States to becoming the great arsenal of democracy. Now it remained to stock that arsenal, a Herculean task after years of willful neglect of military preparedness. Time was the most precious of military assets, and America had already squandered much of it. Dollars cannot buy yesterday, Admiral Harold Stark had said in pleading for the Two-Ocean Navy Bill in 1940. But 1941 saw a flood of dollars directed towards buying the weapons for a tomorrow that was approaching with hurricane speed. By this date, money was no problem, as Senator Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. declared to General Arnold, "It is the general feeling of Congress that, as far as I can gather, among public opinion throughout the country, to provide all of the money necessary for national defense, so all you have to do is ask for it." This shows a huge turnaround in public attitudes. The scale and the scope and the seriousness of the war and the threat that Hitler presented and Japanese militarism in the Pacific presented had clearly, at this point, at least in the view of Henry Cabot Lodge, managed to filter down throughout all levels of kind of national debate and, I guess, national consciousness, so that there was a broad consensus that America had to arm itself, and very quickly. How much America was or should be prepared to arm other countries was a different question altogether. David Kennedy continues. Ask the administration did, for $7 billion in Lend-Lease authorizations and for $13.7 billion in requisitions for the Army and Navy before 1941 was over. A mammoth increase over the paltry $2.2 billion appropriated for defense in 1940. That rising tide of military spending began at last to float the wallowing hulk of the economy out of the Slough Depression, as nearly 1 million draftees filed into hastily hammered green-timbered military training camps, and as war orders poured into the big industrial centres, unemployment sank below 10% for the first time in more than a decade. And this is something that is often lost when students are studying the Great Depression, that nothing that Roosevelt did, short of rearmament, finally really killed the Great Depression, and it was the wartime arms boom that brought unemployment down to almost negligible levels. This is why there's so much anxiety in 1945 that the Great Depression was about to recommence, and it must have been fully in the minds of most Americans that it had been the war and munitions factories that had done the trick. This also shows us that at the end of the day, despite the critics of the New Deal and the protestations of small government libertarians everywhere, when governments inject massive amounts of public money into an economy, it brings it out of depression, it brings it out of deflation very, very swiftly. However, bonds, IOUs, and dollars themselves don't quickly translate into B-17 bombers and warships. Of course, money was at this point no problem. A sovereign state can print as much money as it likes, particularly if there is excess capacity in the economy, i.e. resources that are standing idle, manpower and raw materials. If money wasn't a problem, there were still other obstacles. Ironically, the first one was prosperity itself. Many manufacturers, seeing the huge influx of money into the economy, were reluctant to convert their plants into factories for munitions and other essential war items, knowing that the margins on these were not brilliant, and instead assuming that with all this new cash sloshing around in the economy, they would be the ones to make attractive products for the civilian market, and those products would be the ones that generate the biggest amount of income. Kennedy writes. In the beginning, most of our industrialists were rather cautious about having their companies undertake war work. The RFC head and Secretary of Commerce, Jesse H. Jones, said. They didn't want to invest a lot of their own funds in equipment to manufacture things they believed would not be in demand after the shooting ceased. So there was an assumption that the war might be relatively quick, or that the war with Germany might not happen at all, that you might wind up supplying the military for 6 months to a year and then have to retool the factory once all these orders had dried up and there was no prospect of conflict occurring. The obvious case study here would be the automobile industry. The automobile industry showed the stiffening competition between the demands of the civilian market and the demands of the military on the economy. It's very interesting that you can look at certain parallels with German rearmament and see certain similar tensions emerge. It's like other podcasts, really. I've talked a lot about that one, and you can find that in the archive. Detroit, for example, was expecting 4 million cars to be sold in 1941, which would have been 1 million more than would have been sold in 1939. Walter Reuther, who I've spoken about before in this podcast, the United Auto Workers Vice President, suggested that the remaining estimated 50% of idle capacity would be converted into military aircraft, and that would be under government contract. And the car makers absolutely refused. The speed with which one can turn a car chassis into a fighter plane is, so I'm told, one of the key utilizations of the auto industry in arms making. But the car manufacturers in Detroit said no. The turning of a vehicle and an automobile plant into the making of airplanes was not just a matter of having a different product come out of the end of the factory. Instead, it required new investment, the hiring and creation of new designers and engineers, retooling, retraining of workers, and above all, the diversion of resources from the 4 million cars that were expected to be sold. They were probably going to be hugely disappointed in those targets, by the way, as a result of petrol rationing and other wartime restrictions. In the end, throughout the course of the war, only a couple of hundred vehicles ever get sold. That is how short on new cars America was by 1945. So it required new investment, but it also, Reuter's plan would hand the auto industry over to one customer, and that would be the government. It would be an extremely powerful government and an extremely powerful customer. And the auto manufacturers feared that they would never really leave government employment. And they had the two New Deals of the 1930s had not been particularly well liked by automobile manufacturers and the kind of heads of American capital in general. They had seen government officials pester them about workers' rights, about working practices, about fair trading practices, and a whole range of other things. And to say that they despised the government would probably be fairly accurate. And they had no desire to be in the thrall of such a kind of a fickle business partner as they saw it. Another problem, another organisational problem, emerged, and Roosevelt was unable to see a coordinating body that would be powerful enough to organise economic mobilisation, or at least one that would not repeat the experience of the War Industries Board in World War I, which had essentially taken over the rights and independence of private business and licensed them to be co-opted into the war industry, but also kind of gave them control as well over the national economy. These business elites and their successors had been the real adversaries of Roosevelt through the New Deal. And Roosevelt sort of looked on with dread, really, at the prospect of having to deal with them once again, and also didn't know how he would create this body that would be able to, for example, get around Supreme Court challenges and all the other challenges to Roosevelt's alphabet agencies that American capital had sort of thrown in his path throughout the 1930s. So Roosevelt looked for a way to rationalise economic mobilisation without giving his enemies lots and lots of power. In May 1940, Roosevelt revived the First World War era National Defence Advisory Committee. The NDAC, it was a small, fairly weak and not very effective body that replaced the Office of Production Management, that was replaced by the Office of Production Management in January 1941. The OPM had two directors, the head of General Motors, William Knudsen, and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers President, Sidney Hillman. So he had put together a head of industry and a union boss under one roof, and the joint appointment showed that there was an ambition by Roosevelt to reconcile during the war period the interests of capital and labour. And Roosevelt believed that it would only be possible to create a war economy where you had both capital and labour together working towards a common goal. Roosevelt referred to them as a single responsible head. His name is Knudsen and Hillman. And the most interesting and significant factor about the OPM under the two of them was the fact that Roosevelt didn't really allot much responsibility to either. It was a weak organisation, and this was revealed when Roosevelt supplemented it anyway, the OPM, with two other organisations, the Office of Private Administration and Civilian Supply. That came under Leon Henderson, one of Roosevelt's New Deal economists. High Priorities and Allocation Board, which was run by the Sears and Roebuck executive Donald Nelson. The growth of mobilization agencies, as you can call them, these bodies designed to get a war economy going, meant that economic organization was kept out of the hands of, exclusively of businessmen, and it was really centralized in Roosevelt's hands. He has all these agencies which are relatively ineffectual, and perhaps the point here to create these agencies that couldn't do very much was to have them as reasonably ineffectual, so that Roosevelt really could be making the key production decisions himself, and yet give the impression that was not what was happening, to prevent any threats to his own executive powers. Obviously, this is quite poor administrative practice, but a lot of what Roosevelt did would fall under that description. Roosevelt had essentially started by creating more complexity and more confusion than was strictly needed, something that probably all combatant powers were guilty of, certainly Germany. As at the beginning of 1941, the continuing chaos over who should be organising war production was becoming more than obvious. David Kennedy writes, "It threatened to confirm Nazi Foreign Minister Joachim Ribbentrop's sneering comment that American rearmament was the biggest bluff in the world's history." In addition to this, Lend-Lease exacerbated the situation. It was unclear whether the Americans or the British would have first claim on new tanks or aircraft. It was unclear whether the president believed the short of war strategy would work anyway. If this was the case, what was the build-up of the American military and the million men taking the draft? What would be the timescale of this military build-up? Would troops be demobilized after a year or two? Would tanks and warships and aircraft be decommissioned? And when would the American army be forced to go overseas? All these questions remain ambiguous and up in the air without anyone really willing or able to answer them. If America did send troops overseas, how many would be sent? And what would be the composition of the various divisions sent? How much of it would be tanks? How much of it would be artillery? Would the Air Force, the Navy, the Marines, and the Coast Guard be used as well? None of Roosevelt's service chiefs have the answer to these questions either, and they're really waiting for him to supply them. So these inefficiencies and this chaos was really the result of the last few years of American policy regarding the war and even regarding intervention prior to the war. There had been a groundswell of opinion against intervention. There had been a president who started to move towards intervention, a Congress that slowly shifted in that direction as well, and yet still a reluctance on all parts to become involved short of war. So there was a kind of a fudge, a confusion at the heart of government about what was being proposed and what would have to be done. In Britain, once it becomes clear that there will be war no matter what, the nation in general swings behind an end to appeasement and a preparation for war. So the ambiguity initially did not help America. Knudsen asked, how much munitions productive capacity does this country need, and how rapidly must it become available in June 1941? And he was here asking, really, as a businessman, a very straightforward question. The political answer is not forthcoming well into 1941. In the last few weeks of 1940, Roosevelt reviewed one attempt to set down a comprehensive strategic vision that might guide the future of planning. It came from a memorandum prepared by Admiral Harold Stark, who was the Chief of Naval Operations. Stark laid down 4 options for the American military and naval policy, but strongly advocated the 4th, listed as Item D, or Plan Dog. The Plan Dog basically was part of an older strategic doctrine, codenamed Rainbow 5, one which was the American military's contingency plan during the pre-war years. Rainbow 5 had anticipated waging war simultaneously against 2 or more enemies, which were probably thought to be Germany and Japan. It was assumed that Britain would be cooperative along with France, and it envisaged sending American ground forces to Europe. Rainbow 5's premises revised now to take account of France's defeat and the looming menace that Japan posed in the Pacific. Deeply informed Plan Dog and constituted the foundation of all American strategic thinking from this date forward, that being the words of David Kennedy. So, the structure of America's war from 1941 onwards, a war on 2 fronts, fighting 2 enemies, Germany and Japan, with a force being sent to Europe, is only slightly amended by the catastrophe of the fall of France, which, as I've said in previous podcasts, threw all strategic planning up in the air. Stark emphasised to Roosevelt that under no circumstances could Britain fall. Britain was going to be the landing stage for defeating Germany. Stark said, "If Britain wins decisively against Germany, we could win everywhere. But if she loses, the problem confronting us would be very great. And while we might not lose everywhere, we might possibly not win anywhere." And it was from this reasoning that the American Europe First strategy emerged, this determination to deal with Hitler as the number 1 enemy. Aerial bombing and a naval blockade might be options as far as Germany went, but only landing troops by military successes on shore, only that way could Germany be defeated. It was not only essential to keep Britain going as a comrade, but no less importantly, as a unsinkable aircraft carrier and a marshalling yard from which a successful land action can later be launched. He wrote, finally, "For making a successful land offensive, British manpower is insufficient. Offensive troops from other nations will be required. I believe that the United States, in addition to sending naval assistance, would also need to send large air and land forces to Europe or Africa or both, and to participate strongly in this land offensive. The naval task of transporting an army abroad would be large." And it is in those sentences, in those words, that Stark accurately predicted America's war. And by accurately predicting America's war, he could give Roosevelt a model for war production, for what would be needed for Liberty ships, B-17s, and everything else. Roosevelt was scrupulous not to breathe a word of the Stark plan in public, but he agreed with every word. Anyway, I hope you find that useful and interesting, and I'm going to finish there. Do remember to check out the Explaining History Facebook group, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. All the best, bye-bye.